You heard on the news, Vancouver's safe injection site can stay open indefinitely. BC's highest court has rejected an appeal from the federal government, which was seeking to shut down InSite. By denying the appeal, the court has upheld a lower court decision, which allows the supervised injection site to stay open without permission from Health Canada. The lower court essentially ruled that drug addicts have a constitutional right to the site because they can access help there for what is essentially a medical condition. The case probably isn't over. An appeal to Canada's highest court is likely. Jacob Hunter joins me in studio. Jacob is Policy Director with Beyond Prohibition Foundation. Good morning.
Good morning, Bill.
Give me some detail. What does this mean?
Well, what was interesting about the BC Court of Appeal decision today is that rather than examine it under the constitutional framework of Section 7, which was done in the lower court, the Court of Appeal decided ultimately that the provincial jurisdiction over healthcare, in this case, overrode the federal jurisdiction over criminal law. Now, essentially what that means is that the federal government has the exclusive right to make criminal law in Canada. However, the province has the exclusive right over healthcare. Up until now, criminal law power has been the ultimate deciding authority, and the BC Court of Appeal today rejected that.
Do you expect the federal government to appeal this?
Oh, I expect the federal government to appeal, and I expect the RCMP to be quite on board with that.
With the appeal?
Absolutely.
Which is also interesting. You talk about the division between province and the federal government. The local police, while perhaps not being enthusiastic about InSite, have been pretty supportive of it or pretty tolerant of it.
Well, absolutely. You know, it's telling that the only police force that actually interacts with InSite is completely supportive of it. And I'd note also that the provincial government and the city government are overwhelmingly in support of InSite as well, as are every single scientific study that's been conducted on the site.
Why do you think the federal government is so hell-bent to close it?
Well, I think the Conservative government has pretty much one plank in their platform, and that's trying to appear tough on crime. And ultimately, that if they accepted a rational and scientific view on this, that it would hurt them at their base, which doesn't take well to science or frankly, rationality.
But I think there are a lot of people who would like to see a government be tough on crime, but on the other hand, can look at the other side of the addiction issue and say, while these may in some cases be petty criminals, they are so because of an addiction, and if we could help them with the addiction, they would no longer be petty criminals. But they don't tend to pose a big threat to society.
Well, and ultimately, I mean, I don't think that there is really a conflict between tough on crime and harm reduction. I mean, ultimately, we know from the science that prohibition creates more crime than it solves. So ultimately, the most tough on crime perspective would actually be ending drug prohibition and spending that money on prevention, on harm reduction, and ultimately on regulating these substances so that the people accessing them have a medical need and are not just regular people. This
reminds me a little bit about the debate around something like a recovery house in a neighborhood, where neighbors get upset about the idea that they'll have a halfway house or a recovery house in their neighborhood, but the alternative to that is having raging addicts in the neighborhood rather than people seeking help.
Well, and that's exactly it. I mean, we know these recovery houses and these supervised injection facilities actually decrease the amount of crime in a neighborhood. And we know that they make addicts more likely to seek treatment and less likely to commit crime. So ultimately, it's far better to have a supervised injection facility or a recovery house in your neighborhood than addicts who are simply looking for money to support a prohibition-caused drug habit. I mean,
but to be fair, InSite is not a recovery house, and you didn't raise the term, I did. But InSite, has it been demonstrated that it reduces crime, or has it been demonstrated that it actually bridges people to recovery? Or is it really a matter of keeping people off the street to some degree and preventing them from overdosing?
Well, I think it's all of them. I mean, ultimately, the science has shown that InSite does decrease drug use. It's shown that it makes the addicts who attend to InSite far more likely to enter into treatment. And ultimately, I would point out that there is an addictions treatment center above InSite called OnSite. And they are a frontline service for those addicts at InSite to be able to get into these treatment programs, which I would point out are sorely lacking in funding. We ultimately spend 73% of anti-drug resources on the police, and in 75 years, they haven't been able to tackle the drug problem. We only spend 2% on prevention. That's teaching kids not to take drugs, 2%, and a little over 2% on harm reduction. little over 10 on treatment. It's an absolute travesty when you consider that the harms that are done both on the street to non-addicts and to addicts, that we're continuing to kind of ultimately beat the dead horse of prohibition. It hasn't worked. It's cost billions of dollars, $1.4 billion last year, just arresting drug addicts.
Tell me this. If InSite is as good as you think it is, and I recognize it has a lot of support both in the scientific community and the healthcare community, why aren't we seeing many more of them across the country?
Well, that's a question that the provincial health minister, George Abbott, asked last year. Ultimately, it's because the RCMP and through the minority conservative government are ideologically opposed to InSite. I mean, when you look at the funding and you look at who opposes this, it is overwhelmingly coming out of the RCMP, which I would point out is not a research organization, is a police force that's not meant to be making public policy. But you can see from a pivot lawsuit where the RCMP is involved. You can see in this decision, you can see in their press releases, the RCMP has continued to fight for public policy and ignore their duty, which is to enforce the law, not make it.